Yeah, so hi everyone. Today we have Mingyu as our speaker, and he is a PhD candidate from George Mason University. Today he's going to talk about his work spreading the private blanket, differentially oblivious shuffling for differential privacy. Let's welcome him.
Sorry for the hold. My name is Mingyu. So mostly I work on differential privacy and secure multi-party computation. And so this work is done with Dolph, my advisor, Jonathan Katz at University of Maryland, and also Jerry Xu, who was a postdoc with Jonathan and Dolph, and now he works for Balle.
Oh.
So first of all, I'm going to just quickly recap 2019 work by Balle et al. Of the privacy blanking model, privacy blanking method in the shuffle model. So traditionally, differential privacy is studied in either the global model or the local model. In the global model, you have you assume a trust curator that's going to collect all the personal data from each user, and then later, when upon a query from a trust analyzer, this trust curator is going to compute a function and add some noise to make sure that the output is differential private. And in the local model, you have a trust curator, and in this case, you actually require each user to locally add noise to hide their inputs. And to strike a balance between these two models, it is proposed more recently the shuffle model, in which case, like in the local model, your curator is still on trust, and also each local user needs to locally randomize their inputs, but you additionally have the trust shuffler between your curator and user, which is going to collect all of this message, perform a uniform shuffle, and is eventually submit basically the histogram or set of all inputs to the curator.
Sorry, one very stupid question. Who is the curator?
So curator is like the server that collects and holds all the data.
Okay.
So like in this case, you have individual data, you have curator like, for example, Google's or Apple's, they want to like collect data and do some analysis.
Yeah, I guess the question like why is there like an untrusted analyzer in the first one that it shifts to like untrusted curator?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So because in differential privacy, you have something called post-processing. So as long as we can guarantee that every data at this stage is differential private, then we don't really care what happens after. Okay. This whenever you can run and whatever algorithm you can run, if you want further people in class.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
What can the shuffler do? The shuffler apply any functions on it?
So shuffler just do one thing, just randomly shuffle that inputs.
So for example, can I just do YI, and the shuffler just do the same thing as the left-hand side, the trusted curator?
No, so here the shuffler do a very simple task. It's just commute all the inputs without changing the actual values or anything. So you can think of
cannot change.
Yeah, it cannot change, right? So the change is happening in the local level where each user locally randomizes the input, and they submit the shuffler. The shuffler just shuffle this, and basically you can view the output as a set of histogram.
I see.
Like I understand like okay sure it's in between these two models, but like why shuffling in particular?
Okay, so question. So shuffling is shown in the previous word to amplify the privacy guarantee. Right. So in differential privacy, you always need to study how much noise you need to add and how much utility you get after you have had this noisy output. But with the shuffling, the intuition here is that now the curator cannot see each individual party's contribution. So you kind of protect by all the other parties' input. Right? So now in this case, you need less noise, and less noise means that your data will be in the end will have better utility and better efficiency. So this basically shows that you have the amplifying effect of the privacy parameters, allow you to obtain much better privacy utility trade-off compared to the local. Okay. And yeah, it's a realization from the global model that you have this curator that do all the things and all the things.
What was R?
It's a local randomizer, and I'm going to describe one.
There's a question in the chat. So the idea is that a malicious curator cannot do something that helps a malicious analyzer because of DV post-processing.
Yeah, exactly.
Admirable comment.
Yeah, I guess because of this question mark. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so now I'm going to give you one example of that, which is a very classical function called randomized response. Basically, the idea is that given a probability gamma and a domain D, so X is an input from domain D. So with probability 1 minus gamma, each party are just going to use their real input. But with probability gamma, they're going to randomly choose an input from the domain. Okay. So additionally, we assume that the adversary actually knows all the inputs user wants, and also knows whether a user randomizes its input. And in this case, let's focus on user wants privacy. So let's say the user wants does not randomize its input, otherwise the privacy should be for user. So the output for the shuffling is the histogram, which is basically the set of all the randomized inputs. And the idea here is that in the shuffle model, eventually what you get is kind of like a histogram. And of course, the adversary might be able to identify all the parties who submit a real input due to some auxiliary information. So they can potentially remove this real input, but they cannot remove the noise or the randomized input that's totally independent of those parties' input. So this noise kind of serves as a protection for the target input S1's input. So after removing all this gray area here, you see a noisy histogram. The idea is that the adversary will actually know whether party one has input to or something else.
So the adversary doesn't know whether a input is randomized, but it doesn't know like how it is randomized.
Exactly. Yeah. So if the input is randomized, it's totally independent of its original input. So it does not know what we try to do. So you can think of those as independent.
In the graph, what is on the x-axis?
On the x-axis, oh sorry. So this is let's say domain is 1 to 8. So the number of 1, number of 2. So in this case, let's say x1's value is 2, and then you have some noisy orange part to hide exactly what x1's value is.
I guess like since you shuffle, you're only like the only thing you can do is like count the occurrences of each value, right? So that's
Right.
exactly what you're doing. It's
Yeah,
like
so
counts
then-
and values. Right?
Yeah, so essentially it's a multi-set history.
I'm still confused about the graph. What is the gray and what is the orange?
So the gray are the real inputs corresponding to those parties that do not locally randomize their inputs with this 1 minus gamma probability. So the orange part corresponding to all the parties that with gamma probability uniformly choose an input from the domain. And then the red part is just we figure out the S1's user one's input so that we can give that privacy of the one, even though user one is not locally randomized.
Question? Does the adversary want to find out
Like
what is the purpose of the?
so the purpose of adversary, of course, is trying to know what user wants input. So the adversary knows all inputs that user wants, so he's trying to know user wants input. But what he sees from this protocol is some noisy histogram. So you have a Okay, so formally, Balle et al. prove the following theorem, basically showing that if you have this probability to randomize satisfying these conditions, parameters with domain size delta epsilon, then running this local randomizer followed by a shuffler is some epsilon delta differential pilot. A little less formally, you can think of like for any possible pairs of labeling inputs. So here labeling is defined as differ in one element, and in this example, let's say that water x and water s pi differ in the first element, and the probability of them generating some histogram, any histogram, should be like. So in this case, the adversary won't know whether it's in this word, where S1 has value 2, or whether it's in this word, S1 has value.
Can you just remind us what epsilon delta differential privacy?
Epsilon delta differential privacy. Yeah, so basically, it says, I think I have a better definition. Okay, so basically it says that for any given any inputs and any possible outcomes of leakage, the probability that you have input X generating this leakage is compared to the probability you have input S pi generating this leakage. It's bounded by the multiplicative factor of e to the epsilon and the additive factor of delta.
Right, so e to the epsilon plus delta. That's like the probability the difference in the bounded difference of probability.
Right. So e to the epsilon times probability of S pi generated this.
And that's like that's like pointwise, right? Like for every.
Right. So the quantifier is
Re-entry.
for any possible subset of each. So
Right, and I guess is it? So you have like some lower bound on gamma, but I guess like. I guess even if you're not like in the shuffle model, you'd still have a lower bound like that like a lower bound of the noise that would guarantee epsilon delta differential privacy. I guess probably the bound is worse or something. Is it true like that the randomized response mechanism? Like is this in the shuffle model or is this in like
so this is in the shuffle model.
Okay,
So this is in the shuffle.
but there's an analogous statement.
Yeah. So if you don't do shuffler, then maybe you can think of like or in the case where your number of parties to shuffle is very small, right? So you need larger gamma in order to sample enough noise. And this doesn't necessarily restrain to only the randomized response we just described. In fact, if for any local randomizer that's epsilon locally differential power, and it can be shown that it has this privacy amplifier effect. When you apply the shuffler, you will get a better privacy to each trade.
Sorry, well, what is this epsilon LDP mechanism?
Epsilon LDP. So basically, just like Joel said, it's if you don't use the shuffler. So the curator sees each party's own input randomized, and they show that you can basically show that like there are many mechanisms that like one of the mechanisms is randomized response, and you can use other mechanisms, but eventually you analyze them to show that this actually gives you some form of privacy guarantee. In the case that the curator can see each party.
Thanks.
So I guess is this result is mechanism is optimal? Is this
Oh, okay. So this one is not optimal. So a later work showed that somehow you can improve this, but but our proof that it will generalize to the newer results also.
So this is not optimal.
Right.
Even for randomized response.
Oh, for randomized response, it's so. But for general LDP mechanism, it's not optimal. Not optimal analysis. But for this talk, I am just going to focus on randomized response. Okay, so our main idea here is that at the end of this state, what you get is some output that you claim to satisfy differential privacy. And if you use a trust shuffler, so first of all, you probably don't want to rely on any trust third party. And if you use a fully secure shuffler, it's going to be an overkill. Because at the end of the day, you will just get differential power. So our idea is that whether you can use something less secure and but get more efficiency. So in the past, there are many protocols that to achieve this shuffler security. For example, it is a DCLAT, miss levels, or any MPC protocol using communication level as differential shuffle. All of them require bit omega n square communication.
So is that communication between the users and the shuffler, or?
So those are the total communication. Right, right. So the communication between the user and the shuffler.
Okay.
Right. So in those cases, if you think of it, your trust shuffler is instantiated, for example, like all the users doing this shuffling. So this communication cause of this implementation of this shuffle.
Oh, I see. So you would implement this as like some MPC protocol, or like?
One way to do that.
I
So
see.
you mean there's no trusted shuffler, the users are shuffling themselves using a protocol, that's what you mean, right?
Yeah.
So what is the trust threshold?
Sorry.
What is the trust threshold for the MPC? Like how many users are honest and how many users are trusted?
So it differs from different techniques. Right? So I know that for sequential shuffle, you just need one party to fully shuffle. And communication level, I think it usually appear in the work that you have two parties to do the shuffle, and I guess you can generalize to multiple parties. Right. So I guess for different techniques, it has different correlation.
So is it like all of them require quadratic communication except this as described by Moga value?
Right. Right. As far as
and your paper and Endo as well.
right, as far as we know. So in the Malahadi's paper, they studied secure multi-party shuffle, and they basically used a community-based approach to bring down the cost. In Endo's work, it's based on onion routing, and they actually show that it only requires analog and bits, but they have a very high bottleneck complexity, and also in the malicious setting, their usage of dummy onions message incurs a large constant overhead. So our question is whether we can come up with something that it's asymptotic optimal like Endo's, but at the same time be more completely efficient in the malicious setting. Okay, so the realization we use is differential Oblivious shuffle. So the basic idea is to allow this shuffle process to leak some additional information. But if you think of the traditional definition of differential privacy, it is usually defined for the labeling inputs that differ in 1 inch, like in this case, y1 and y1 pi is different. But you cannot use this labeling definition because no shuffle process can be both differential private and correct. Recall that the output of this shuffle process is just a histogram. So if you just change 1 inch, your histogram is going to change.
So when you say correct, what do you mean exactly?
So I mean that if you don't like change the input of the shuffle somehow, if you want to keep the input as the same cell, you just do the shuffle, and then the histogram is always going to be different. Okay. So instead, we use the definition of labeling vectors that define y and y pi as labeling if they differ by a transposition. So basically, you take 2 of y inches and swap them, you get y pi. Right? And for the rest of the position, they are just the same. Okay, so formally, we have that a shuffle protocol. It's epsilon delta differential Oblivious for T correlated users. if for any adversary that corrupt the server and up to T users, and for any YA, so here YA corresponding to the inputs of the corrupt users, and for any labeling only users input, and here labeling is defined by transposition, and any set V of possible wheels or leakage that is observable by adversary, the probability that you generate such set of leakage is bounded in these two cases.
So I guess here you haven't like formally defined the view function. Right? Like-
Yeah, I didn't formally define the view function. So technically it should include the histogram and some of the additional leakage that you
So one question I had, I looked at your paper, but I guess like the construction is actually computationally but this definition
Yes.
is statistical, so I feel like it's better to define
Right.
computational version. In our follow-up work, we did change it to a computational version, and you can look at that paper.
Right. I read it. Yes. I think that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now we replace the trust shuffler with the differential video shuffler, which uses sigma to same bit, and then on top of the histogram, we also have some additional leakage to the trust curator or the adversary in general. So our main theorem is that if your differential oblivious shuffler is epsilon delta differential oblivious for T corrupt users, and if the original mechanisms, local randomized mechanisms with trust shuffler is epsilon pi delta pi differential pivot for T corrupt user, then replacing this trust shuffler with our differential oblivious shufflers will give you basically the summation of their policy elements. Right, so if you think of what this means, is that usually in differential privacy, you have some privacy budget. So now you can use differential oblivious shuffler to take some of the differential privacy budget there from your output and achieve a more efficient output. And this appearance also extend to any local differential power mechanisms. So basically, we extend the odds and odds generic theorems also to our default shuffler.
Does that mean that you can like instead like S would be no shuffler and sigma would be the actual like shuffler without additional linkage? Is that like your theorem applies if that covers that case as well?
So you mean here?
Yeah, so I guess Balle, so the generic theorem for local differential power is like when S is
so generic theorems I am referring to the any epsilon locally.
Oh, I
differential
see.
power mechanisms.
So are you doing like are you just composing this with zeros? Is that necessarily?
I'm not sure what you mean by composing theorems.
never mind.
Yeah. Think of a randomized response as one of the epsilon LDP mechanisms. So we also show that this result can be generalized to Okay, so let's go with a high-level intuition of our proof. So for simplicity, I'm going to trace some accuracy here. So basically, what we want to show eventually is that for any pair of leakage and histogram, the probability when giving an input x and input x pi here, in this word, the probability of generating this leakage and histogram is roughly the same as in the other word that you have a different input and generate the same leakage and histogram.
And sorry, is this leakage model like general? Like if you start with any differentially oblivious shuffler, like for some leakage model, then it just carries over? Is that for any leakage model? Or is that like something more specific?
So far we haven't defined what long this
Right.
leakage is. So basically, in practice, when you have this construction, you need to analyze like what the leakage the can see and identify that. But basically, if you can show that it's Epsilon delta divided by Oblivious, then you can. So in Balle et al.'s work, basically what they show here is that like again, treating accuracy for simplicity is that in the labeling case, if you have X where the first party's input is 1, the second party's input is 2, then the probability of generating some histogram should be likely. So recall that in that case, they use structure, so there is no additional leakage. So what this means is that imagine that in order to generate this histogram after you apply the shuffler, this means that before you apply the shuffler, the input to the shuffler must belong to some set of vectors. Like so, basically, this set of vectors has to be consistent with the histogram by having the same number of 1 and same number of 2. And also, at the beginning, we said that since we are targeting user 1's privacy, so we assume user 1 does not randomize the inputs. So in this set of vectors, we need to make sure that in Y, all the first inches should be 1, and in Y pi, all the first inches should be 2. Right? And then we basically have two distinct sets of vector Y and Y pi. So where we are going from here, so basically we assume, so now let's just make a big assumption that, which is true for this case, Y and Y pi has the same cardinality, and also there is a one-to-one mapping of transposition. Like the first vector here is 1, 2, 1, 2, and the first vector here is 2, 1, 1, 2. So we swap the first element and second element with the other one. So you have the transposition here, which means that if you use this transpose vector as the input to your differential Oblivious shuffler, probability of them generating some same leakage and histogram should be like. So how's a little bit to see? Okay. So once you have that, you have a way to move forward this equation here. So this is the left-hand side of this oscillate equation. So the probability of generating this leakage and histogram is the summation of the probability that you first locally randomize your input to some vector Y in the capital Y. So for example, I localize your input to 2, 1, 2 here, and then the probability of using this Y as input and your differential Oblivious shuffler output are some V and H. So what Balle et al. Prove is basically the summation of this probability is likely in these two cases. And here we additionally have this relation here, this probability is likely. So essentially each term in this summation is almost likely in the two cases and allow us to bound the probability between this and this. So this is the high-level iteration of the proof. So I just want to quickly mention that there's a cardinality of Y pi are not always the same. In fact, most of them are not the same. So to determine that their cardinality, consider this case where you have 3 1s and 2 2. Recall that the first elements must be 1 in the upper case, and the first element must be 2 in the lower case. The cardinality here is basically 4 choose 2. So how you position your 2 1 elements, and the cardinality for the Y pi here is just 4 choose 1. So 4 position you can place 2. And then I use the edges to represent the transposition relation, which means that you can swap a pair of elements to get the one. So in this case, we don't have a very clean way to do what we just did. So the solution here is to just like, this is just to help the analysis. We duplicate these workers to make sure that they have the same cardinality. And then we can show with automatic theorems, there must be a one-to-one mapping of transposition between these now duplicate workers. And basically this fall into our special case that we just described and allow us to apply the same method to prove our theorem. Okay. Before I go to the construction, anyone has any question? Okay, so we first show that how we construct differential Oblivious shufflers in the semi-honest set. So our idea is a very basic one. We use onion routines. Basically, each user will randomly pick -1 user uniformly. So one thing to mention that we do assume that all parties took part into the mixing. So in each round, you are going to choose from all n parties that it's in this take part in the this protocol. So you choose for each user in each round you pick one user uniformly as your intermediate host, and then you only increase your values in the reverse form. So here, the adversary is powered, as described before, with corrupt the server or the curator, which eventually get all the data. And also, we assume you can passively, non-identically corrupt a version of user. Like, for example, you corrupt a user for here. So, however, we make a small realization since now we are having all n parties taking part in this mixing. We make a small realization to assume the adversary cannot observe all the level links of between any honest user. And in general, you can also assume the adversary can partially observe some of the level links. And in that case, you can simply use a larger corruption threshold here. So we first describe our method to give proof for zero delta differential Oblivious shuffle. So this is actually quite simple. So in here, I'm basically using this onion path graph to represent whether a user chooses an honest node or corrupt. So a white node is a honest node, and a gray node is a corrupt node. Notice the last node is always corrupt because it belongs to server, and the first node of the honest user is always honest. So I use the story arrow to indicate that this message or onions is observable by the adversary. So recall that we said that the adversary cannot observe the level links between honest user. So this only happens when the adversary either corrupt the sender or receiver in a particular round of this message. So in this zero epsilon case, we additionally simplify the problem by assuming the adversary can also identify the onion part of the remaining user used into n minus d, and we want to see what privacy guarantee give for the remaining two users we want to retrieve. So for the case here, it's actually a good case because that in round 3, both user 1 and user 2's message is hidden. So from the adversary point of view, it could also be this case where they basically swap here, so that user 1 actually send value B, user 2 actually send value B. And the case below is a bad case apparently, because that in this specific case, user 1 always choose corrupt node as the host, so the adversary can actually observe the full path and associate A with user 1. But in general, if you don't have some rounds like this that both parties have honest receivers and honest sender for their message, you can claim that as a bad case. Okay, so then this delta can just be computed as the probability of this back case, which is the probability that you run numbers of Bernoulli tries and then you don't get consecutive successes.
So I guess I have a question. I feel like, so if T is like some constant fraction, like an R is super logarithmic linearly round, you can just get oblivious, right? Because the delta will be negligible.
Right.
Is there any, I mean, normally we want delta to be smaller than 1 over n anyway. Even if it's like differentially oblivious.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So I guess.
So why not just like state it as fully oblivious then? Just set this to be a negligible function.
Oh, so why don't you just say this as a fully oblivious?
If you set it to be a negligible function, it's like essentially it's like
Okay.
statistically oblivious.
Right. So the argument is only against like labeling. So even though you can achieve negligible delta here, you're still arguing against any labeling inputs, not against any.
Yeah, but if it's negligibly small for any two
Um,
inputs, you can swap from one to other in polynomial make it that.
Right. Yeah, I guess you
Even
can.
not.
Yeah, apply the group privacy to them. Yeah, similar like this.
So in this case, it's just statistically oblivious if that is negligible.
Right. Yes. So in the non-zero epsilon case, we did a more complicated analysis. So in this case, we no longer assume the adversary can just rule out U3 to UN minus T. By the way, we let user one, we just assume user one can use M minus T to be honest. In this case, we do not assume the adversary can just rule out U3 to UN minus T.
Wait, sorry, I'm confused about this one and the previous one.
Okay.
Are they the same protocol?
So they are the same protocol, but with different analysis. So in this one, we make a big assumption to assume the adversary can just exclude all the remaining on this party. So all the adversary want to receive is just a leakage corresponding to this. But here we just don't make this strong assumption. And now,
Okay, can you explain this assumption again? Maybe I didn't get that. So
Okay.
you're saying under some assumption you can prove that it's oblivious, but under some other assumption you can only prove it's DDL. So
right.
this is, you are making some extra assumption.
So here I'm making some extra assumption where the adversary can just know more information than he can.
But doesn't that make the adversary more powerful?
Yeah, it makes the adversary more powerful. So here we make the adversary less powerful, even though we cannot claim a fully oblivious result, but we can claim a better epsilon delta.
But adversary more powerful should be more difficult to defend against. Right? Is the reason that here the R is smaller? Like I don't know how to compare these results because it seems like you are saying when the adversary is weaker, you are proving something weaker.
Okay, so here, yeah, so here the R is definitely small. So you need to use less one to achieve the same delta.
So okay, so what is P? Like I don't understand the parameters.
Okay, so P is the the ratio of all these parties. Which should be probably better state should be M minus T divided by N.
And how many rounds are you running? None of this depends on R. The theorem doesn't depend on R, which is why I find it really strange. Is it delta 1 and delta 2 depend on R?
So one of the delta 1 here depends on R. And delta 2 is used for another like that case to bound the delta. Yeah, so
Yeah, I think if you don't specify the parameters, it's just very hard to compare the two results.
I see.
And it feels a little bit strange that you're saying when the adversary is weaker, you get a weaker result. But I'm sure that's not the case, but it doesn't show in the theorem statement.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so I should have made it clear here, like for this more complicated analysis, we can achieve, we can use much less round to roughly achieve the same.
Roughly,
Uh,
I'll like, what's the difference in the number of rounds between the two settings? Do you know, like?
Yeah, I'm actually going to show a graph following the
Okay.
end for our experiment, but
Okay.
maybe like depending on your corruption threshold and probably like 4 times more rounds in the views can 3 to 5.
So I have one more question about the P. So P is the fraction of honest players.
Mhm.
So that means epsilon should be quite large. Like, let's say I have half honest players,
Mhm.
then I guess, yeah, just let's say take that log to be log or something, then
Right,
that's
so
2.
so in our experiment, epsilon is usually something like 1, 2, 3, something like that.
Then I guess then in the definition that epsilon appears before like it's a to the epsilon times some probability plus delta
Right.
in the definition. So okay, so that is roughly like e to the 1 to 3 something
Mhm.
times that probability plus delta.
Right. So that the ratio can be like it's larger. It's like it's in different cases.
Okay. Thanks.
So to see how we do this analysis, now let's just remove all the things that the analysis cannot observe. You cannot observe this dash message. You doesn't even know like what those user n minus t is here. In this case, why is this provide you some form of privacy guarantee, even though that U1 and U2 do not have a same round that they can extract a message like before? Because if you think this chain of 2 messages here, the adversary actually do not know this message belongs to U1 because it's neither attached to the beginning or to the end. What we call it is just a dangling chance, and it's very possible this chain actually fit into user NT here. So it's a user n minus t chain, and now user 1 has all this hidden message in the middle, and it's potentially possible that user 1 and user 2 make a swap here. So to formally analyze this, we now captured the leakage of our differential condition protocol can be divided into the pure chain and dangling chains. So basically, pure chains refer to all those chains, all those messages that the adversary knows who they belong to. Like here, the message comes directly from user 2 in the first round to a corrupt node of the adversary. So you know this message comes from user 2, and you also know which honest user he forward this message. And we additionally assume the adversary actually knows all the ending chains of party U3 and to U minus T. Like in the worst case, the adversary knows their input, so they can associate this input with the original user. Okay. So once we take out all the pure chains, what we have remaining is all the dangling chains. Like I said in the previous slides, the adversary actually does not know which of this chain belong to from the get-go. It certainly knows that you need to satisfy some constraint, like these 2 chains cannot belong to the same parties, but it does not know that this chain must be user 1 or user 3. Okay? And also you have these 2 ending chains corresponding to user 1 and user 2, where the adversary is trying to determine whether user 1 is this chain user 1. So basically, this is the leakage the adversary actually see if you choose an onion path like this. So this leakage is good in some sense because it kind of provides some specifications. Where in one case you have user 1 send A, user 2 send B, and in the other case user 1 send B and user 2 send A, there are some possible onion paths such that their leakage are corresponding to this leakage. If you think of this, you're like just moving around this dangling trends around, so that you allow the user 1 and user 2 to have both hidden message in one stream, then you can train some form of privacy. So eventually, what we are going to do, or what we did, is to bound the ratio between the probability of generating this leakage in this case and the probability of generating this leakage in this case, which is essentially comes down to how many possible onion paths in one case and how many possible onion paths in the other case that can satisfy this input constraint and also generate this leakage. So this is how we get an epsilon and also a small delta term that is going to give tau. So we also have a delta 1 term which capture kind of the worst case like a scenario when, for example, user 1 always choose a malicious no, then all the remaining noise won't matter anymore. The adversary can always distinguish. And at the end of this stage, together we claim that this is epsilon delta 1 possible to dimensionalize. I'm actually going to show the actual parameter after I give the introduction on the malicious setting. So in the malicious setting, it's well known that for onion routing, if the encryption scheme is non-malleable, and if you use timestamp and identifier in each layer of the onions to prevent replay attack, the only attack the adversary can do is to drop the honest user's message. And we only consider security with a bot, so the reliance service is out of our consideration. So if you think of what drop message indicate here, it's actually catastrophic for our differential oblivious definition, because if you drop one message, your resulting histogram is going to change. Right? And so, but if you think of what it means for the whole shuffle model in a whole, if you draw some party's message, the adversary or the server will not learn that true value of that party. They actually give it trivial privacy. So, in order to formally argue this, we use weaker definition of differential oblivious that also tolerate drop message. By tolerate, I mean that when defining labeling vector, we restrain to only the transport elements to belonging to those surroundings. Okay, so basically the goal here is to just limit the number of messages that the adversary can drop. And our solution is also very simple. We just send each party to send one actual dummy message along with the real message, and then and to monitor the drops. So basically, the first round is the same as the semi-honest protocol, is that each party also send one actual dummy message, and then at round R, each user is going to check whether its dummy message survive, and using this message, they will determine whether more than a threshold of real message has been dropped, and abort if you exceed this threshold. So what the privacy you get from this this method is that if you can guarantee that less than a certain threshold of honest messages are dropped, you equivalently get a differential oblivious shuffler with like a little bit less number of honest users. And in this case, you have n minus d, where d is the upper bound of the drop message, and t, of course, is the corrupt message. So your privacy parameter actually degrades smoothly with the number of job messages. Skip this one. Okay. So for performance, for 0 epsilon, so we show that this here. So for the different corruption threshold and divided by n over 4, n over 3, n over 2. For example, for n over 3, in order to achieve roughly 10 to the -6 delta, you need about it will be over 100 rounds and about 343 kilobytes party communication cost. The result in the more complicated analysis where you introduce a non-zero epsilon is much better. For example, here, if you want to achieve roughly the same delta, you only need like 60 or 65 rounds. And since this cost is quadratic to the one capacity, so you probably just need like 100 or something kilobytes. So recall that we have delta 1 and delta 2. And so in the case we analyze with more complicated analysis, we discover this trade-off between epsilon and delta 2. And we also have delta 1, delta s to capture that those packets appear in here and also in the when we're trying to achieve malicious security. Okay, so at the end of this stage, our claim is that our run capacity it's independent of n, it's one. The communication capacity is O n log n plus n log d, which is domain. So this is domain size. This number of bits of total communication. So completely we use this assumption, and then for t equal to n over 3 coercion, we estimate what the likely one and 156 kilobytes per user to achieve this privacy parameters. And here the cost is for any n that's less than 1 million and domain size less than 2 to domain size less than 120. So from our hardest work, it's roughly half or to 1 gigabytes and quite much more ones. And for Endo's work, it requires log for lambda dummy message. Well, lambda is a security parameter. So in malicious setting, even though there is a faulty claim, it's optimal, but in malicious setting, this complete number is much larger. So there is also another word, Balle et al., which also kind of decide to fit into this shuffle model. So in some sense, their cost is so they provide two constructions which allow them to claim the minimum of either n times domain size times log n or n squared log n bits. And so they actually outperform us in store domain, like if your domain size is only 100. But in general, if you have domain size that's of the scale of number of parties, our protocol is much more efficient because it's asymptotically. Yeah. Okay, so some of the future direction that we can think about. So first of all, we can think about new construction for differential Oblivious shuffler. Maybe use a better analysis here or under different assumptions of adversaries power or other level setting on scenario. So also, it will be interesting to see whether we can use DO shuffle beyond the shuffle model and in the end claim some form of different policies like security. And also, it's interesting to see whether this any generic differential privacy inspired security realization can be used to substitute some of the primitive in the secure multi-party computation to achieve a more efficient protocol in strange for less security damage. And that's all. Thank you so much. Questions?
I guess I'm still a little bit confused about the epsilon. So, can we go back to the definition of like epsilon delta? I think it's like in very early page.
Maybe it's epsilon.
I mean, in the definition.
Oh, differential is definition.
Yeah. So like if epsilon, let's say if epsilon is 2 or something, so that means the probability on the right hand side should be like less than, let's say 1/4 originally.
Right. So in the worst case, it will be divided by 4 times e to epsilon times. And also some small additive difference.
Okay.
So this is really the worst case scenario because you quantify all possible set of leakage. You can imagine, although that's not really policy. People care about a lot of leakage. It doesn't necessarily differ by that.
I see.
So this is like the worst case for all possible set.
Thanks.
We have one more.
I think
I
that's,
think
no, it's
that's
the same
the-
one from before.
Yeah.
Can you explain your malicious model again?
Okay.
Yeah, so you say you care about security with the board.
Mhm.
But then why do you still care about like the job message? That like if you can detect that any message is job, then you can just support the protocol, right?
Right. Yeah. So, but in order to detect that, we use dummy message. So it's actually possible for the adversary to draw some, like with some non-negligible probability, for the adversary to draw some real message without drawing any dummy message. So you cannot detect that. So in those cases, basically we give a bound active probability. The number of real message draws is bound by certain number if you do not detect any dummy message.
I see. So the dummy message is just used to detect whether any message is dropped or not.
Right. So basically the idea is that the adversary cannot distinguish the dummy message with the real message. So when you try to draw it, the best way you can do is to probably just draw. So you will not be able to draw.
And also when you compare with the series of protocol, so I think you mentioned that some of them are working for the disaggregated setting, but here you focus on like this turnover rate.
Right. Yeah, it's possible for this. Actually, also for the dishonest function setting, but if I put those there, the curve is going to out. So the part is going to be the long way. So that's why I R to M O2. But yes, our analysis works on any general constant pressure.
Okay, thank you.
Questions?
But he flew all the way to come here.
No, it's something else.
Yeah, I guess if there's no other question, let's thank me again.